For millennia, the Xylosian Empire had catalogued emerging civilizations with an air of detached amusement, their confidence rooted in a seemingly supreme understanding of cosmic power. However, no amount of historical observation could have prepared them for the day humanity invited them to witness supposed military exercises, an event destined not merely to challenge their assumptions, but to violently shatter their entire perception of reality. The formal invitation, an artifact transmitted using what the Xylosian High Command derisively labeled as archaic radio wave technology, materialized upon the ornate console of Grand Admiral Vorlag, a being whose 6 optical sensors had calmly witnessed the cyclical rise and fall of fledgling civilizations across innumerable star systems for longer than human history had even existed, its arrival prompting a distinct ripple of what could only be interpreted as condescending amusement throughout the fleet's most rarefied strategic echelons. Humanity, a species barely managing to cling precariously to the lowest rungs of interstellar travel, a civilization whose rudimentary grasp of quantum mechanics was generously described in Xylosian academic circles as endearingly naive, was extending an invitation to the undisputed masters of galactic warfare to observe their so-called grand maneuvers, an event Vorlag privately likened to unweaned infants, inviting seasoned battle-hardened gladiators to witness a particularly vigorous session of rattle-shaking. The prevailing sentiment permeating the High Command was that attending such a patently absurd spectacle would prove a tedious affair, a purely perfunctory diplomatic gesture towards a species that might perhaps in several centuries, and with considerable Xylosian guidance, eventually contribute a minor footnote to galactic history. Nevertheless, the ancient protocol Dictate 7-9 clearly outlined the necessity of observing emergent species' military capabilities, however laughably primitive. Thus, a delegation assembled with considerable reluctance was dispatched aboard the observer vessel, the Whisper of Inevitability, a craft whose cloaking systems alone represented a technological leap centuries beyond Earth's entire collective scientific understanding, which then slipped into the Terran orbital sphere with the silent grace of a leviathan assessing docile prey, its powerful sensor arrays cataloguing the quaint orbital defense platforms and cluttered human satellite network with a mixture of dry academic interest and barely concealed disdain. The human liaisons described in internal Xylosian reports as earnest to the point of being almost painfully polite presented bulky data slates detailing the proposed war games filled with what the aliens perceived as laughably simplistic scenarios involving inefficient chemical propulsion, crude projectile weaponry, and tactical doctrines exhumed from pre-warp historical archives. High Commander Thal, selected to lead the observation team, settled into the command chair of the Whisper of Inevitability's primary observation deck, his multiple eyes meticulously scanning the assembling human fleet, a motley collection of vessels that looked like repurposed cargo haulers awkwardly fitted with oversized inefficient thrusters, and he suppressed a slight tremor of his primary mandibles, the Xylosian equivalent of a deeply exasperated sigh, as he mentally began to prepare his official report, which would undoubtedly describe this endeavor as nothing more than a quaint little military theater. As the first human vessels commenced their ponderous, clumsy initial formations, appearing to drift more than maneuver, Thal leaned back, anticipating a long, predictable morning, completely oblivious that the very foundations of Xylosian military doctrine, refined over 10,000 years of cosmic conflict, were poised on the precipice of being systematically and utterly dismantled before his soon-to-be uncomprehending eyes by the very theatrical primitives he had so casually dismissed. As the so-called grand maneuvers officially commenced, High Commander Thal's multiple optical sensors instruments capable of resolving particulate detail down to the subatomic level across vast cosmic distances were immediately assaulted by a bewildering display of what could only be generously described as strategic anarchy, a veritable ballet of apparent blundering incompetence performed on a galactic scale that made his refined tactical sensibilities recoil. The human vessels, those lumbering constructs conspicuously belching plumes of chemical propellants in erratic patterns, broke formation with an almost gleeful disregard for any established combat doctrines known to the Xylosian military archives, their movements resembling not a coordinated fleet but a panicked herd suddenly discovering three-dimensional movement. Unbeknownst to the Xylosian observers on the bridge of the human command vessel, Unflinching Resolve, Captain Marcus Thorne exchanged a brief, knowing smirk with his tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Anya Sharma, who merely nodded her eyes, glinting with concealed amusement as she confirmed, "Signal patterns optimal for calculated chaos. Captain, they are receiving exactly the performance we rehearsed." Back on the Whisper of Inevitability, the Xylosian crew observed how energy signatures from the human ships flared and then abruptly died with no discernible pattern, suggesting either a shocking rate of catastrophic system failures or a complete misunderstanding of basic energy weapon deployment. The advanced Xylosian sensor arrays designed to predict complex quantum entanglement fields struggled profoundly to find any coherent strategy within the human fleet's seemingly random dispersal. Individual ships would suddenly accelerate to improbable velocities using brute force chemical thrust, expending colossal amounts of propellant only to then execute ponderous, inefficient turns that gratuitously exposed their unshielded flanks, inviting swift annihilation in any real combat engagement according to thousands of Xylosian war simulations. Human communication channels, when decrypted from their simplistic schemes, were a cacophony of what sounded like emotional outbursts, nonsensical coded phrases and arguments about nutrient paste flavors, further reinforcing Thal's assessment of these beings as charmingly chaotic but hopelessly unprepared for galactic power dynamics, their ships often appearing to drift aimlessly in contravention of their own stated objectives. One squadron of human destroyers engaged in a bizarre series of interwoven spiraling ascents and descents that served no apparent tactical purpose, consuming vast fuel while achieving no discernible positional advantage, a display so bafflingly inefficient it bordered on abstract performance art. High Commander Thal found his initial smug amusement rapidly curdling into profound academic perplexity. This was not merely primitive warfare, it was illogically, almost aggressively primitive, as if the humans were deliberately flouting every known principle of energy conservation and tactical coherence. Amidst this bewildering display of meticulously organized ineptitude, a junior Xylosian sensor analyst, her voice barely an audible whisper, tentatively pointed a quivering appendage towards a recurring, faint energy fluctuation that seemed to pulse in perfect synchronicity with the most chaotic human maneuvers, a signal too faint for automated threat assessment, yet stubbornly, inexplicably, present a tiny, dissonant note in the symphony of human folly that sent an unexpected and deeply unsettling chill down Thal's primary neural stem. High Commander Thal, initially quite inclined to summarily dismiss the junior analyst's tentative observation regarding those faint, almost ethereal synchronous energy fluctuations as mere sensor noise, perhaps some peculiar, undocumented byproduct of humanity's remarkably inefficient chemical propulsion systems, or even a subtle form of atmospheric interference unique to this particular solar system, found his multifaceted attention increasingly almost unwillingly drawn back to these persistent anomalies as the purported grand maneuvers lumbered onward into their third, tedious hour. The human fleet continued its perplexing, almost hypnotic dance of apparent utter disarray across the vast, star-dusted void of space, and the subtle pulses so faint as to be almost indistinguishable against the pervasive background radiation of the Terran system began to correlate with an unsettling and undeniable consistency to moments of extreme human tactical deviation. A squadron of particularly ungainly human cruisers, for instance, would execute a maneuver so bafflingly illogical it bordered on the strategically suicidal, and precisely at that exact moment of peak apparent chaos. The faint rhythmic energy signature would spike for a single fleeting microsecond, its intensity momentarily flaring before vanishing completely, leaving only a lingering unease among the sensor technicians. His chief science officer, a venerable Xylosian whose profound understanding of advanced quantum mechanics was legendary, reported with growing concern several distinct instances of inexplicable sensor ghosts, transient unverifiable readings, strongly suggesting the momentary presence of exotic energy outputs, far exceeding humanity's documented technological capabilities, only for these tantalizing readings to abruptly collapse back into the expected parameters of primitive chemical reactions, leaving the bewildered science team to recalibrate their delicate instruments, repeatedly muttering about unforeseen atmospheric distortions, or perhaps some uniquely human form of sophisticated electronic warfare they had yet to categorize. Even more disturbing were the fleeting whispered reports from astrogation analysts who noted tiny, almost imperceptible spacetime distortions localized around human vessels during their most erratic accelerations, minute gravitational ripples that simply should not have been possible without advanced gravity manipulation technology. Humanity was supposedly millennia away from conceptualizing. On the human flagship unseen by Xylosian eyes, Captain Thorne received a quiet update from Lieutenant Commander Sharma, Phase 1 distortion fields. Performing nominally, Sir, the Xylosians are logging them as sensor ghosts and localized anomalies, just as projected. Their science teams must be having quite the debate. Thal, priding himself on cold logic and unwavering faith in Xylosian superiority, felt an unfamiliar prickle of profound unease, a sensation akin to discovering a single, perfectly machined gear tooth hidden within a crude pile of hand-carved wooden blocks. It simply did not fit the established narrative. He reluctantly ordered his sensor teams to conduct more focused, albeit still entirely passive scans, exercising extreme caution not to betray their growing bewilderment, but the data returned was maddeningly inconsistent, a confusing tapestry woven from threads of blatant incompetence and sudden flashes of something so technologically advanced it defied immediate comprehension, with those faint, rhythmic energy fluctuations continuing their ghostly, almost mocking accompaniment to the human fleet's chaotic ballet, leaving High Commander Thal to wonder with a growing sense of dread if the persistent whispers in the dark of his sophisticated observation deck were merely echoes of overactive imaginations or the first faint warnings of a truth far more unsettling than their initial arrogant assessment had ever allowed them to consider, a truth that hinted at a deliberate, almost playful deception. The unfolding spectacle of apparent human military ineptitude reached a new, almost farcical crescendo during a meticulously simulated asteroid belt ambush scenario, where a designated human Blue Force flotilla, tasked with escorting a high-value convoy, sailed directly and with astonishing confidence into a clearly telegraphed Red Force pincer movement, their sensor discipline apparently non-existent, and their defensive formation so poorly maintained that several escort vessels nearly collided catastrophically with their protected charges. High Commander Thal observed this predictable catastrophe with weary confirmation. This, he subtly signaled to his subordinates, was precisely the level of profound tactical naivety they had anticipated, reinforcing every preconceived notion regarding humanity's primitive grasp of spatial warfare. And he almost instructed his analysts to begin drafting the section of their report detailing gross tactical incompetence subcategory asteroid engagements. Just as Red Force ships began simulated weapons, lock their energy signatures flaring with textbook precision, and the Blue Force convoy appeared utterly doomed, its command ship inexplicably broadcasting cheerful popular music. The inexplicable occurred with a suddenness that sent ripples of profound disbelief through the Xylosian observation deck. One Blue Force destroyer, previously noted as critically crippled and drifting helplessly, surged forward with an impossible burst of sustained acceleration, its antiquated chemical thrusters blazing with an intensity that, according to Xylosian physics, should have torn the vessel apart, executing a tight gravity-defying turn that positioned it directly between the convoy and the lead Red Force attacker, its supposedly primitive projectile weapons firing in a perfectly timed, impossibly accurate volley that registered as a direct simulated kill on the Red Force flagship. Simultaneously, those faint, ghostly synchronous energy pulses that had plagued Xylosian sensors intensified dramatically momentarily, overwhelming their delicate instruments with unclassifiable energy readings, and transient shimmering spacetime distortions flickered erratically around the now rapidly recovering Blue Force vessels as their seemingly chaotic dispersal resolved with breathtaking speed into a surprisingly effective defensive screen that caught the bewildered Red Force attackers in a devastating crossfire of precisely targeted simulated impacts. On the human command ship, Captain Thorne watched the tactical display, a grim smile playing on his lips as Lieutenant Commander Sharma confirmed Phase 2, successful captain-controlled disaster, executed. Their reactions are noteworthy. The Xylosian science officers, whose careers were built upon immutable physical laws, could only stare dumbfounded at their flickering readouts, their comforting theories of sensor ghosts and human incompetence evaporating completely in the face of such blatant physics defying success, born from what had moments before been unmitigated disaster. This left High Commander Thal with a deeply unsettling realization that the line between human incompetence and some incomprehensible hidden mastery was becoming terrifyingly blurred, forcing him to urgently question if these repeated, controlled disasters were not accidents at all, but meticulously orchestrated movements in a grand, unfathomable game whose baffling objectives the Xylosians were only just beginning to suspect they could not ever fully understand, a game where the stakes might be far higher than they had ever dared to imagine. High Commander Thal found himself increasingly adrift in a turbulent, disorienting sea of conflicting data streams, each new, bizarre human maneuver deepening the already vast chasm between what his millennia of rigorous strategic training dictated as sensible warfare and the utterly bewildering spectacle unfolding relentlessly before his multiple strained optical sensors, forcing him to confront the increasingly uncomfortable question of humanity's true, utterly baffling objective. The exercises had now thoroughly devolved, at least from a rational Xylosian perspective, into a chaotic series of seemingly disconnected resource-intensive displays that served no discernible strategic purpose their advanced analytical systems could identify. Vast quantities of irreplaceable fuel were expended on intricate ship formations that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Their supposed projectile weapons were discharged erratically into empty quadrants of space, creating complex debris fields, and entire squadrons engaged in what looked like elaborate high-speed games of tag, their movements devoid of recognizable tactical positioning or mutual support. The Xylosian analysts, renowned for their ability to deconstruct complex alien strategies, produced reports filled with increasing uncertainty, their sophisticated predictive algorithms failing to assign any logical intent to human actions, with one prevailing, though privately ridiculed, hypothesis suggesting the humans were not rehearsing for warfare but engaging in some elaborate planetary-scale celebratory ritual, or perhaps more alarmingly, a meticulously orchestrated prank designed to confuse and frustrate observers with feigned incompetence. Yet interspersed within this frustratingly opaque tapestry of apparent cosmic tomfoolery were those undeniable chilling moments of impossible precision and physics, defying success, always accompanied by the now familiar yet still unexplainable synchronous energy pulses and localized spacetime ripples, hinting at a technological sophistication far beyond what humanity openly displayed. One particularly perplexing incident involved a lone human frigate previously noted for its erratic course plotting, suddenly accelerating to an impossible velocity without discernible propulsion flare, phasing inexplicably through a dense field of simulated mines as if they were intangible, and then precisely disabling 3 designated enemy sensor platforms with pinpoint accuracy, using what its own signature identified as simple kinetic impactors, all before calmly rejoining its squadron as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, leaving Xylosian sensor logs filled with terabytes of data their brightest minds could only categorize as unverifiable anomaly pending urgent further investigation. Human communication channels, despite increased decryption efforts, remained a source of profound frustration, filled with bizarre cultural references and nonsensical inside jokes about nutrient paste, offering no insight into their overarching strategic aims, only deepening the mystery and leaving High Commander Thal to stare into the void, a cold dread settling in his primary processing core, as he realized that with every passing hour the Xylosians were not getting any closer to understanding humanity's intentions, but were instead being drawn deeper into a perplexing enigma, an elaborate performance whose true purpose remained tantalizingly out of reach, even as the human fleet began to subtly shift their formations a change in tempo, hinting the bewildering overture might finally be drawing to its long, awaited, and perhaps terrifying main act. As the disparate elements of the human fleet began to slowly coalesce, their previously erratic movements now subtly shifting into what appeared to be a more recognizable, albeit still highly unconventional pre-engagement formation, a palpable sense of weary relief settled over the tense Xylosian observation deck, a collective, silent exhalation from beings who had spent a standard Terran day fruitlessly attempting to decipher coherent strategic intent from apparent large-scale chaos. High Commander Thal, despite the persistent gnawing unease challenging his fundamental assumptions, allowed himself a brief moment of grim satisfaction. Finally, it seemed the baffling humans were abandoning their bewildering theatrics and preparing for what their liaisons had enthusiastically termed the grand finale, a phrase the Xylosians privately interpreted as a prelude to more pointless fireworks and a harmless display of primitive projectile weaponry. The Xylosian analysts, visibly eager to return to familiar datasets, began inputting the new human formations into their powerful simulation engines, their algorithms quickly generating scenarios based on humanity's documented technological level, scenarios overwhelmingly predicting a swift, simulated victory for any opposing force employing rudimentary Xylosian tactics. The prevailing theory among the assembled Xylosian strategists was that this grand finale would showcase humanity's most powerful, yet still fundamentally primitive, kinetic armaments, perhaps a massed barrage aimed at some designated target drone, a bombastic display for internal human morale more than any genuine demonstration of advanced military capability. Unseen by the Xylosians aboard the human flagship, Lieutenant Commander Sharma gave a crisp nod to Captain Thorne, her voice calm but laced with an almost electric tension. Phase 3 initiation sequences green across the board. Captain, all fireworks are primed and synchronized. The audience is about to get their money's worth. High Commander Thal even permitted himself a rare internal chuckle, imagining the human commanders flushed with perceived success, preparing to unleash their ultimate yet insignificant display of brute force, completely unaware their every move was being meticulously analyzed by a vastly superior civilization. His chief attaché efficiently began composing the preliminary draft of their final report, the section detailing the grand finale already pre-filled with dismissive phrases like rudimentary demonstration of massed fire capabilities and predictable over-reliance on unsophisticated kinetic impactors based on the unshakable assumption that what was about to unfold would be merely a more energetic version of the preceding hours of strategically irrelevant activity. As the human fleet achieved its final, strangely asymmetrical, yet undeniably purposeful-looking configuration, and a new, more intense and deeply unsettling series of those now disturbingly familiar synchronous energy pulses began to emanate from deep within their tightly packed formations, a silent hum that resonated uncomfortably with the Xylosian ship's own sensor arrays. High Commander Thal settled back, preparing to witness what he confidently expected to be the loud, messy, and entirely predictable culmination of humanity's primitive ambitions, completely unprepared for the earth-shattering reality that this grand finale was not an ending at all, but the horrifying paradigm-destroying unveiling of a truth that would rewrite far more than just their reports. The anticipated crescendo of humanity's grand finale began not with the deafening roar of primitive chemical rockets or the clumsy barrage of solid kinetic slugs the Xylosians had confidently predicted, but with a profound, almost unnerving silence that suddenly fell over the entire human fleet, a palpable stillness more unsettling than all their previous chaotic maneuvers combined. Then, without warning, the faint, synchronous energy pulses that had been a mere background whisper surged violently, coalescing into a single, overwhelmingly powerful and utterly unidentifiable harmonic resonance that vibrated with frightening intensity through the very molecular structure of the Whisper of Inevitability, causing the sophisticated Xylosian observation deck to thrum with an unknown, deeply troubling energy their instruments struggled even to categorize. High Commander Thal watched his multiple optical sensors flickering wildly as they struggled to process the impossible physics-defying sight as the human vessels, those previously dismissed junk piles and repurposed cargo haulers, began to move with breathtaking, utterly impossible synchronicity. Their seemingly disparate thruster systems now firing in perfectly timed, microsecond-precise bursts, weaving them with astonishing speed into an intricate, impossibly complex geometric formation that pulsed with the same unified, terrifying energy signature, a colossal formation actively manipulating local space-time geometry, bending light and distorting sensor readings in ways that defied all known Xylosian science. The Xylosian science officers. Their usual calm shattered their instruments. Screaming, unprecedented alerts reported rapidly escalating, localized gravitational lensing effects and transient high-energy quantum field disruptions emanating not from a single advanced weapon, but from the entire harmonized human fleet, acting as one colossal, coherent energy projector, a feat of engineering and coordination that, according to all Xylosian principles, should have required computational networking and power generation millennia beyond humanity's documented grasp. Before High Commander Thal could formulate an order, the human fleet, now glowing with a soft, ethereal light, as if channeling the stars themselves, unleashed not a volley of crude projectiles, but a focused, impossibly narrow wave of coherent, multidimensional energy that tore silently and with terrifying speed through the designated target zone filled with hardened sensor drones. In that single, horrifying instant, the drones did not just explode, they simply ceased to exist, their quantum signatures vanishing completely from all Xylosian sensors, as if reality itself had been selectively unwritten, leaving only a lingering, chilling distortion in the fabric of the void. On the human flagship bridge, Captain Thorne allowed himself a grim, almost predatory smile as Lieutenant Commander Sharma reported, Phase 4, weapon unveiled, all target telemetry confirms successful erasure, standing by for their appreciation. But the chief Xylosian science officer, whose lineage traced to the first Xylosian to unlock nuclear fusion, simply stared, his primary mandibles agape, his analytical mind comprehensively broken by the sheer, elegant impossibility of a weapon that seemingly erased matter by manipulating fundamental universal constants orchestrated by a species they had dismissed as primitives. And as the unsettling, otherworldly energy from the still, glowing human fleet began to subtly, almost imperceptibly but undeniably, reorient itself with cold, calculating purpose, High Commander Thal felt a visceral wave of absolute paralyzing terror, a horrifying premonition that the true, devastating brilliance of this grand finale was not merely the unveiling of the weapon itself, but the horrifyingly real and entirely unsimulated lesson it was about to teach its utterly unprepared and now utterly terrified Xylosian audience. The horrifying, paradigm-shattering realization dawned upon High Commander Thal not as a gradual understanding or a logical deduction, but as a brutal, instantaneous shockwave of pure comprehension that overloaded his sophisticated neural pathways and sent his 6 optical sensors into uncontrolled spasms. The chilling truth, delivered not by his panicking sensor officers babbling about impossible energy readings, but by the sudden, terrifying activation of the Whisper of Inevitability's own highly advanced automated defensive systems, countermeasures designed for existential threats so overwhelmingly powerful their activation was considered a purely theoretical contingency never expected outside of the most catastrophic doomsday war simulations. The ethereal, multidimensional energy wave, having effortlessly unwritten the designated sensor drones from existence, did not dissipate. Instead, it reconfigured with horrifying sentient speed, its focal point tightening with chilling accuracy, its impossible energies now painting not the empty void but the heavily cloaked, supposedly untraceable Xylosian observer vessel itself, with targeting parameters of such pinpoint, unwavering accuracy that High Commander Thal knew with a certainty that froze his very marrow. This was no accident, but a deliberate, cold, calculated demonstration aimed directly at them. Alarms blared with deafening intensity throughout the previously orderly Whisper of Inevitability, a discordant, panicked cacophony of dire warnings as shield integrity plummeted. Sophisticated quantum entanglement fields, designed for invisibility, flickered and then catastrophically failed under the relentless onslaught of exotic energies. Their most advanced science could not categorize, let alone counter, and the ship's highly sophisticated artificial intelligence, normally a serene voice of pure logic, began to emit long, garbled strings of panicked, corrupted data, mirroring the abject chaos on the observation deck, where seasoned officers, beings who had calmly faced cataclysmic, stellar phenomena, were now scrambling in primal terror, their ingrained discipline shattering. "Admiral!" screamed the chief tactical officer, his voice a raw shriek of pure disbelief, as he pointed a trembling appendage towards the main view screen which, despite failing cloaks, now showed the human fleet holding their impossible glowing formation with terrifying stillness. Those were not simulated targets, they were merely decoys, the weapon its focus. It was always meant for US. The elegant energy radiating from the human fleet did not strike the Xylosian vessel with crude force. Instead, it gently, almost tenderly enveloped the Whisper of Inevitability in a shimmering cocoon of impossible physics, and High Commander Thal watched in horrified fascination as his ship's most advanced systems, the pride of Xylosian engineering, were not violently destroyed but systematically, elegantly, and utterly neutralized. Their powerful energy conduits rerouted, their formidable weapon systems rendered inert, their advanced propulsion drives irrevocably decoupled, leaving them adrift, powerless, silent, and completely at the mercy of a species they had mere hours ago arrogantly dismissed as infants. The profound silence that descended upon the once proud Xylosian observation deck after their critical systems failed was more terrifying than any battle cry, a heavy silence punctuated only by the ragged gasps of beings whose entire understanding of the universe and their civilization's place within it had been irrevocably shattered, leaving High Commander Thal to stare blankly at the serenely glowing human fleet, the silent architects of their profound humiliation and harbingers of a new, terrifying galactic order, with the horrifying realization that this grand finale was not just a weapons demonstration, it was a brutal declaration, and the audience participation, so cruelly and perfectly orchestrated, was a terrifying lesson the Xylosian Empire would never forget, assuming they were even allowed to survive long enough to warn others of the silent, terrible power that now lurked within the human sphere. The curtain call of humanity's shockingly effective grand finale was not marked by overtly triumphant declarations broadcast across the void, or by stern demands for unconditional surrender from the victorious humans, but rather by a chillingly polite, almost unbelievably casual transmission originating from the human flagship, its seemingly archaic radio waves somehow piercing the lingering quantum distortions still clinging around the crippled, powerless Whisper of Inevitability, with an effortless ease that was in itself another profound layer of calculated humiliation. The message flawlessly translated into perfect High Xylosian simply stated, "Observation, concluded you are free to depart. When your primary systems recover functionality, we trust the demonstration was sufficiently informative." High Commander Thal, his intellect still reeling from the paradigm-shattering implications of what he had just witnessed, could only stare mutely at the distant human fleet as it began to leisurely disperse its individual vessels, breaking their impossible luminous energy formation with the same baffling, unhurried grace they had displayed throughout the terrifying exercise, their previously dismissed junk piles now imbued with an undeniable aura of overwhelming power, leaving the stunned Xylosians adrift in a heavy, suffocating silence more damning than any shouted ultimatum. The departure of the human fleet was as unsettling as their initial performance. There were no ostentatious victory laps, no mocking taunts, just a quiet, almost perfunctory withdrawal, as if neutralizing the most advanced observer vessel of the galaxy's preeminent military power was merely a routine system diagnostic. An act of such supreme understated confidence, it spoke volumes more than any overt display of aggression. It took nearly 3 standard Terran days, an eternity of silent dread, for the Xylosian crew, for the Whisper of Inevitability's critical systems to partially recover enough functionality to attempt interstellar travel, a harrowing period during which the once proud Xylosians, stripped of their assumed technological superiority, underwent a collective, silent re-evaluation of their civilization's place in the cosmos, the arrogant pronouncements of their high command now echoing as foolish boasts. The long journey back to the Xylosian homeworld, begun with such condescending amusement, was now a somber, introspective pilgrimage, each surviving crew member grappling with the terrifying knowledge that the galaxy was no longer the predictable Xylosian-dominated place they believed that a species dismissed as primitive possessed a hidden depth bordering on the divine or demonic. High Commander Thal's final meticulously detailed report sent unprecedented shockwaves of fear and disbelief through the core of the vast Xylosian Empire, a stark account that brutally dismantled centuries of cherished military doctrine and replaced it with a single, chilling imperative. Humanity was not to be underestimated, not to be provoked, and if possible to be studiously avoided until their true terrifying potential could be even partially understood. The day human war games ended an ancient empire's arrogance marked not just a temporary shift in galactic power, but the irrevocable dawn of a strange new era, an age where old certainties were shattered, where the line between amusing theatre and terrifying mastery had been indelibly redrawn, and where the quiet, enigmatic species from a pale blue dot called Earth now cast a long, profoundly unsettling shadow across the galaxy, a shadow filled with unanswered questions and a dawning existential fear of what other grand finales humanity might yet have in store for an unsuspecting and now deeply apprehensive universe.